Okay, so good morning and welcome back to Classical Mechanics 1 course at CMI. Today is, I think, the fifth lecture, our fifth meeting, 5th October 2011. Yeah, so I believe there was a question from Siddhant Shah, is it? Please go ahead.
Sir, yes, sir. In problem set 2, question 3, you've asked, you've said identify the condition based on the matrix, on a matrix, right? A, B, C, D.
Interpret the question, interpret the result based on that matrix, yes.
So like an equation in that matrix, or I'm not sure how to.
Sure, yeah, an equation concerning that matrix would be fine.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sir, I actually have a question.
Please identify yourself when you speak.
Sir, I'm Rajdeep Ghosh.
Yes, please go ahead.
Yes, sir. So I was done with that question, but it really bugged me because I could not sort of see why we would care about the vectors x cap plus by cap, because they're not even the images of x cap and y cap under this transformation.
Okay, there is. Okay, I have not described the full story in this problem.
Yes.
I have not described the full story. Maybe sometime when there is more time, I will describe the more story. I mean, there is some differential geometry involved here, which I am suppressing. So yeah, so
the math part is okay, but why we would care about them in the first place is a little weird.
Okay, but no. See, this was based on a question from the audience. Now, I don't know who asked this question. It was about, the question was, suppose we make some change of coordinates. In this case, we have done a linear change of coordinates. Yes. How do we know, can we guarantee that the new coordinates are such that the vectors along those increasing directions are orthogonal or normalized? How can we guarantee that? Or is it automatically guaranteed? This was the sort of question that came up. If somebody who asked it can identify themselves, I'll be happy. Yeah, so this problem was a partial attempt to start addressing that question. Yeah, so I request you to hold on. This will be elaborated on further either in this course or elsewhere. Yeah.
Okay.
Sure, I understand your concern that the full story is not here.
Yes.
I will need to introduce yet more terminology and notation and so on. So okay. I am parceling it out in small bits.
Sure.
Yeah. Nature reveals itself in small bits also. So we have to be, no, I am just making excuses, but it is a fact. Nature reveals itself only in small bits. We have to probe it, find out the meaning, and then turn things around. Sometimes we have to do that. So take me to be nature for a moment. Yeah. Any other question? Okay. Yeah. So we have 61 participants present. I hope we will have, of course, your previous course with Professor Karandikar, is that over now?
Yes.
Okay, great. Yeah. Okay. So yeah, a couple of small requests or instructions. Please, in the problem set, please do not submit a zip file. Preferably PDF or JPEG file is acceptable. Zip files, unfortunately, are very hard to handle through Moodle, especially when we are handling so many files simultaneously. And also, if you are submitting something through a tablet preparation, that is an iPad or other such tablet, please ensure that your file is paginated, that it is broken up into pages. A single long page, again, is very hard to view through Moodle, and ensure the pages are of reasonably standard sizes. Otherwise, it is very difficult to see them and grade them. Yeah.
Sorry, I didn't catch that full thing. Could you repeat it once?
Yeah, no, we have seen submissions which are Okay, your submission may run into 5 pages in the normal course of events, but suppose all those 5 pages are made into one single long page with a very strange aspect ratio. Yeah, and that thing is uploaded to Moodle. We are finding it difficult to view such a submission. So this is not an issue that concerns most of you. It is only 1 or 2 cases like this. So I request tablet submissions to be broken up into standard size pages. Is that understandable?
Yes, sir.
Yes.
But just to confirm, one PDF with multiple pages is okay, right?
Exactly.
That-
One
okay,
PDF with
okay.
multiple pages, okay. One PDF with a single page running into 4 standard or 5 standard pages is not okay.
Okay, sir. Understood. Thank you.
Sure, you are
Excuse me,
welcome.
sir.
Yes. So this is who?
Sir, this is Ishan.
Ishan Banerjee. Yes, please.
Yes, yes. Sir, while I was trying to upload the last PDF, I saw that there was a limitation in the size in Moodle. Sir,
Yes.
what shall I do in that cases? Because if in case the PDF gets a bit long.
I would suggest, so the maximum limit is 2 megabytes. So please put it through some online compression software. You can reduce the file size that way so that it is still legible. And reduce, I mean, if there is some unnecessary white space or empty pages and other such things, please cut them out so that the file size decreases.
Okay, sir. Okay, sir.
Yeah, I think majority of you have been able to manage that. So I hope you will be able to do that. There are online compression softwares for PDFs as well as other file types which you can use. Any other?
Sir, we haven't discussed spherical polar coordinates. So are
Yeah.
we going to do that?
Yes,
or
today.
We have to
Today-
do it by ourselves.
We will do it here today in a few minutes. That is Shakti Chauhan.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Any other questions? Okay. So yeah, let me share my screen in that case. Yeah, just one comment about the previous first problem set. There was this question about shifting the origin and asking how does the torque on a particle change? Now, when you shift the origin of then the radius vector of the particle changes. The radius vector of the particle changes. However, the force on the particle does not change because the force actually acts on the particle at the location of the particle. It is independent of the origin of your coordinate system. So the force does not change. The radius vector gets shifted, goes to r plus a or r minus a, depending on how you set it up. And therefore, the torque will also change. The torque is not invariant. The torque is defined with respect to an origin. So the torque will change, and it will change by an amount given by a cross f or minus a cross f, depending on how you set up your system. So this was something that I think confused a few of you. I can in fact go back to the figure, perhaps. Figure of the force. Any question about this, by the way? You're welcome to ask while I search for the figure.
Sir, I have a question.
Yes, please.
That is Srimati.
Yes.
Last time when we were talking about coordinate functions, you
Yes.
said x square plus y square is equal to r square is not a coordinate function. I didn't understand why.
X squared minus y squared. Is that what you said?
X square plus y square is equal to r square. I mean like a circle or
Okay. See, to talk about coordinate functions, you need to first have a coordinate system. So we have to have some agreement. Shall we talk about Cartesian coordinates, for instance? So then your coordinates are x and y. By definition, x and y are coordinate functions. Yeah. What is a function, first of all? It is simply a real valued, a gadget that defines a real number to every point on your space. So that's what a function is. Now, x squared plus y squared is one such function. X squared minus y squared is another such function. X itself is one such function. Y itself is one such function. Right? I mean, after all, x assigns the abscissa of your location to that point. It is some number. So you are comfortable with these functions?
Yeah.
Okay, now among all these functions, we pick two and call them distinguished functions, namely coordinate functions, namely x and y. End of story. All other functions are not coordinate functions. So x squared minus y squared is not a coordinate function for Cartesian coordinates. Now let us change to a different coordinate system, like polar coordinates, r theta. Now, since you change your coordinate system, the coordinate functions also change. Now there will be r and theta. Whereas r squared is not a coordinate function. It is the square of the coordinate function. Or r sine theta is also not a coordinate function. It is a function of r and theta. Does that clarify the thing?
I mean, is this important, sir? Like, is it important to understand what?
Well, it is terminology that is useful. So don't worry if you don't get it right now. But see, the notion of a coordinate function depends on your coordinate system. So in Cartesian coordinates, there are only two coordinate functions, namely x and y. In polar coordinates, there are only two coordinate functions, namely r and theta. To a point, r assigns the distance from the origin. To a point, theta assigns the counterclockwise angle from the horizontal axis. That's it. Yeah.
Yeah.
All other functions like cosine theta, sine theta are not coordinate functions. Is that slightly better? Clear?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Okay. Now regarding torque, I think I have said it in words, but I am still searching for a figure which I may have lost. Let me. Okay, I think I'm not able to find it right now, but let me just draw it in that case. Yeah, so let us just quickly talk about torque. You have a coordinate system, Cartesian coordinate system. You have a radius vector going to the instantaneous location of the particle. You have some force acting on the particle. I mean, we've not talked about forces in much detail, but my operational definition is that the force is a vector from the current location of the particle. That's very important. The force is not a vector pointing from the origin of your coordinate system. It knows nothing about the origin of coordinate system. You apply a force on a particle where it is. Now, the dependence on the coordinate system and the origin of the coordinate system enters mainly through the radius vector, the position vector, not through the force. So suppose now I change my origin, go to a new origin like this, O prime, then the new radius vector is going to be R prime. So the original torque was tau, was R cross F. Yeah. The new torque, tau prime, is equal to R prime cross F. The F does not change. The two are of course related because the two origins are displaced by a vector A. Let us suppose that the origin O prime is at the location O prime is at A relative to O. Yeah. So then from this triangle, you see that R is equal to A plus R prime. R is equal to A plus R prime. And therefore you get a relation between the two torques. Yeah, so tau prime or let's say tau, for instance, tau is equal to A cross F plus R prime cross F, which means that tau is equal to A cross F plus tau prime. This is the relation between the two torques. Okay. Any question about this? Okay, so now let us return to our discussion of polar coordinates. We were talking about plane polar coordinates, which now I think you have become relatively familiar with. Just to recapitulate, polar coordinates were defined as a x is equal to r cos theta, and via the equations x equal to r cos theta and y equal to r sin theta. And this was the figure. Then we went
Sir,
on. Yes,
sir?
please. Yeah.
Sir, I didn't get why do we need to shift from Cartesian coordinate system to plane polar coordinate system? Like, what is the like extra feature we are getting from plane polar coordinate?
Good question. The reason is that in some problems of physics, there may be certain symmetries present, such as symmetry with respect to rotations about a point. And in such circumstances, or for instance, if there is a heavy central object around which other bodies are moving, or there is a wire carrying some current and you are looking at the magnetic field around it, a straight wire. In all these problems, or even in an atom where there is a heavy nucleus and electrons around it, in all these problems, it is found that Cartesian coordinates are not particularly convenient. Many features of the system are revealed in polar coordinates rather than in Cartesian coordinates. That is because Cartesian coordinates lay great emphasis, the polar coordinates lay great emphasis on the distance from the origin. Yeah. And if there is a very distinguished physical object at the origin, then that is very helpful. On the other hand, Cartesian coordinates have the advantage of being, they don't particularly pay emphasis to the distance from the origin, but they have more to do with translations in X or translations in Y. If those are symmetries of your problem, then Cartesian coordinates are very useful. Okay? So it is really a question of what problem you want to solve. And depending on that, different coordinate system can be more helpful. We will see examples of this, of course, in the upcoming discussions. Does that provide some insight?
Yes, sir. Yeah.
Okay, that was Ishan Banerjee, is it?
No.
I'm sorry, what was your name? Shakti Chauhan?
Chauhan.
Oh, okay, yes. Yes. Yeah. I now know your voice. So I can, next time I should not make that mistake. Okay, so coming back to our discussion of polar coordinates, we had described the trajectory of a particle in polar coordinates. So the radius vector of the particle or the position vector of the particle was written simply as r hat, where r is the distance from the origin. Yeah. So starting from that position vector, we computed the velocity vector, which is r dot. There were two terms, and a key property was that the unit vectors in the r hat and theta hat direction do not have a fixed direction in polar coordinates. As you can see from this picture, at these two locations, the r hats point differently. So we had to find out how does r hat change along a trajectory, and we did that. Similarly, we had to compute how theta hat changes along a trajectory. We did that too. Using all those results, we found a formula for the velocity of the particle, and let me display that formula. It is a very nice formula. V is equal to r dot, and that was given here. There are two terms, one of which, so it's a r dot r hat plus r theta dot theta hat. So these two terms have some name and meaning. So r dot r hat is called the radial velocity, while the other one is called the angular component of the velocity. Okay. Azimuthal component or angular component of velocity. And we observed that for circular motion, the radial velocity is simply zero, and you have purely azimuthal velocity. Now we go to the next step of discussing acceleration in polar coordinates, and that involves simply taking one more derivative, namely that of velocity. So let us just sketch that. So a vector is defined as boldface v vector dot time derivative. For that, we take d by dt of the sum of two terms, namely the radial velocity and the angular velocity, so to speak. Now there are going to be four terms coming from differentiation of r dot, r hat. Oh, actually, r, theta dot, and theta hat. So you have to differentiate all these animals. And let us just go through slowly. So the first term is going to be r double dot r hat. Okay, r double dot r hat. Then you have an r dot times r hat dot. That's what we've written here. Then we use the product rule of differentiation. By the way, what is the name? The product rule of differentiation is named after a famous scientist. What is the name given?
Leibniz.
Yeah, so Leibniz rule. So we use the Leibniz rule of differentiation, and you're going to get 3 terms when you differentiate a product of 3 quantities. So the first one is r dot theta hat, then r theta double dot theta hat, and finally r theta dot then theta hat dot. Okay, so this is straightforward, and we simply need to substitute our formulae for r hat dot and theta hat dot, which we painstakingly computed last time. We had discovered last time that r hat dot is given, it has purely an azimuthal component, purely angular tangential component given by theta dot theta hat. Okay, so this is a computation we had done last time. And similarly, we had also computed theta hat dot and found that that has a purely radial component with coefficient minus theta dot. So if we substitute these 2 expressions in this 1 and 2 and put things together, we will notice the following. I mean, at the end of the day, A is a vector, and this is a vector in a 2-dimensional space. So it must be a linear combination of r hat and theta hat. Okay, so you just collect the terms involving r hats. So there's the first term involving r hat. And then the last term also involves r hat because d theta hat dt is proportional to r hat. So the first and last terms combine, and their combination is written down here. Yeah, the component of A in the radial direction has 2 terms, namely r double dot coming from the first and r theta dot times another theta dot coming from the last term with a minus sign. Okay, so that is the radial part of the acceleration, radial component of acceleration. The remaining terms in the middle, the 3 terms in the middle, I'm sorry, I think. Oh, okay, that was something else. Yeah. So the remaining 3 terms in the middle are all proportional to theta hat. So we just combine their coefficients. The first one is an r dot times theta dot, because that's coming from dr hat dt. But there is another term which involves r dot theta dot, namely the second one. So those 2 add up to give you 2 r dot theta dot. The last term remains as it is. This penultimate term remains as it is. It is r theta double dot. Okay, so there we are. We have our expression for acceleration of a particle along a trajectory in 2-dimensional space. Now, once we derive such a formula, we will try to give a physical or names to interpretation to the various terms that appear. So let us briefly do that. Any question about the manner of calculation we have just followed? Okay. So as I was saying, the various terms in the acceleration have physical interpretations. The first one, namely r double dot r hat, is called the radial acceleration. In some sense, this is the most naive possibility. It started with r hat, differentiated twice, you will get r double dot r hat. Okay, so this is called the radial acceleration. Then we've got the next term that is proportional to r hat, but it is necessarily radially inwards. Yeah, because it's minus r theta dot squared. For uniform circular motion, we have already met this term, this acceleration. It is called the centripetal acceleration, pointing radially inward. In that case, it was minus omega squared r. That was the magnitude. So for minus omega squared r for circular motion. Okay, so this is the generalization of that. The motion need not be circular and need not be uniform either. But you will always have this, there's always the scope for having this centripetal acceleration. Then we have two more terms. We have the r theta double dot theta hat term. Now that is called the angular acceleration that comes from the varying speed theta dot of the particle, varying angular speed. Yeah, I should be clear about that. So theta dot was the angular speed, and if that varies with time, this term is present. So that is the term r theta double dot. The last term is a cross term, so to speak. It is the term 2 r dot theta dot in the theta hat direction. This is given a special name. It is called the Coriolis acceleration, after a French scientist who studied such things. We will meet him again. There's something called the Coriolis force as well, which is distinct from the Coriolis acceleration, which is present. The Coriolis force is present in a rotating frame of reference, like a merry-go-round or the Earth. So we will talk about it later. But this is the Coriolis acceleration is always present whenever both r and theta change with time. Namely, the particle is not at a fixed distance from the origin and also not at a fixed angular location. So if you have motion of that sort, then you will always have this Coriolis acceleration. So all we have done is calculate the acceleration and given some heuristic interpretation and names for the various terms. So you will meet these again and again. So it's well worth having such a formula for future reference. Okay, so this is as much as I want to bring up in the context of plane polar coordinates. We will now make a brief, we will briefly discuss spherical polar coordinates. Any questions so far? Yeah. Okay, before I do that, a couple of comments about the way you answer the questions in the problem sets. I already mentioned, please do not submit zip files or PDF files that are not broken up into pages. A single PDF file containing several pages is fine. Another request, please write your conclusion. You have done some calculation, you have to write a conclusion. What is the result? It's not enough just to write some formulae. So please do write a conclusion. Another thing is that it is not necessary to copy down all the questions that have been already given to you. Yeah, you can answer the questions. I mean, if you want to briefly write what is asked, you are welcome to do that. But some of you have actually copied the entire question paper. That is not necessary. And in one case, I think, yeah, I had not defined what associative or non-associative means. I think all of you, most of you have looked it up or are aware of it, and that is excellent. I think in one case, there was some confusion between associative and commutative. It's a bit unfortunate. But anyway, if you're not familiar with the term, please do look it up or ask me. Sure. Okay. So,
sir,
yes.
for the conclusion,
yeah,
is it okay if we like box the final result we get instead of writing a separate conclusion? Or?
Yeah, see, what I mean is that, okay, suppose I am asking you to show by a counterexample that the cross product is not associative. All right. Now, imagine your answer consists of proposing some three vectors A, B, C, calculating their cross product in different orders with different parentheses and getting two answers. Now, that is not sufficient. I mean, even if you box the final formula, it's also not sufficient. You need to say, and therefore, this is not, and therefore they are not associative. Therefore, the product is not associative. You have to say something.
Yes, for this one, sir. For questions for which boxing something is naturally serving the purpose of a conclusion, then
yeah, that's also fine. Sure. Yeah. So okay, let's make it clear. Your common sense is very trustworthy, and you can use your common sense. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, so that was Rishi Nanda Vanchi.
Uh, Vanchi is my last name, so.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Okay, so yeah, no, see, the thing is that there are a lot of students, and every year we get more students. So to know your name or some connection, I want to know the full name. Otherwise, I will be lost. Yeah. So okay. So any other questions? I think I need to pay attention to questions in the chat box as well. I might have missed some of these earlier.
Sir, what is a dot called? A up above dot called, like you were asked. You asked in the test.
I'm sorry, Shakti Chauhan, what is your question? A dot?
What is a dot called? A dot.
A dot.
Like
yeah.
R dot is velocity. So what is a dot?
What is it called? Oh, good question. Yeah, you want to give a name for the rate of change of acceleration. I think I would like to suggest that you come up with a name. Sadly, we don't have any common name for that, or at least I'm not aware of it. So if you can come up with a nice name.
I think it is called jerk, if I'm not wrong.
Okay, perhaps. Okay, I've heard that term. I wasn't aware that it is okay. I didn't know whether it's precisely this, but okay, perhaps it is called joke. So anyway, it's a good question from Shakti, and somebody has answered. Who is that who answered?
Is it actually useful for us, sir?
See, the rate of change of acceleration comes up occasionally. Here we were just observing that it tells you something about the acceleration vector going around in a circle, but it's not something that you encounter very often. Yeah, I must say. I mean, acceleration is much more common. The rate of change of acceleration, I mean, it's an important quantity, but we don't often speak about it very often. So yeah, and that reflects my lack of immediate ability to come up with a name for it.
I think it's used more often by engineers than us.
Perhaps. Yeah, sure. So yes. So, I mean, I have seen that word, yes, but you may be right. Okay, so there are some questions in the chat box, which I guess I need to address. Sir, how much file size is limited to on Moodle? 2 megabytes. They could increase that to 5 megabytes. I'm sorry, please try to keep things to that size. I have actually put the maximum amount that they permit. Okay, and okay, so Anand Ishan Banerjee has said jerk, and okay, yeah. Anyway, I would like to keep it at 2 megabytes. I think that is quite substantial for a few pages of text and drawings. So please try to keep within that limit. Okay, I mean, if they have allowed us to increase the limit, I will look into that, but I don't favor that, having very large file sizes. Okay, any other questions? Okay, and Soham Chatterjee has invited you to use a particular app to reduce the size of your submissions. So perhaps that will be useful to you. Okay, if there aren't any more questions at this point, I would like to proceed to spherical polar coordinates.
Sir.
Yes, please.
Sir, my name is Sam Agarwal, and I wanted to ask if we could write the solutions to the assignments on a sheet of paper and click the photo and convert it into PDF.
Yes, please. That will be excellent. Yeah.
Or, sir, if there is
but
an
just
option,
put them into a single file. I mean, if you have several pages, please put them into a single PDF file.
Okay, sir.
Yeah. Sorry, what is your any other question about that? Ishan Verma says that PDFs are already compressed. How can you compress it further? Please go to smallpdf.com or I love PDF, or there are so many software online. You can compress PDF files, even if your computer doesn't do that for you. Okay, so now coming to spherical polar coordinates, the analog of plane polar coordinates in 3 dimensions are called spherical polar coordinates. These are particularly useful in describing systems like the hydrogen atom, the solar system, and other such physical systems where there is a central object, that a distinguished central object or spherical symmetry. Yeah. Okay. So now these are 3 coordinates because it's in 3-dimensional space. So these are really coordinates on R3. They are called R, theta, and phi. And they are given names. R is called the radial coordinate, theta is called the polar coordinate, and phi is called the azimuthal coordinate. These symbols are standard. Now let us define what they are. So given a point P with Cartesian coordinates x, y, z, the radial coordinate is defined as the distance of P from the origin. Okay. So that is simply the square root of x squared plus y squared plus z squared. That is, the radial coordinate is simply that, this distance, these are. Okay. Now, let me define the remaining 2 coordinates. So now if P has position vector r relative to the origin, then the polar angle theta is defined as the angle that the radius vector r makes with respect to the upward vertical z-axis. So returning to my figure, this is the position vector. This angle is theta, and it is measured from the vertical axis downwards. Okay. From the vertical axis downwards. This angle is theta. The theta angle is measured in a plane that contains the z-axis and the radius vector. Okay. These 2 vectors, namely z hat and r, define a plane, and theta is the angle between the 2 vectors in that plane. So we can say that theta is equal to, or rather the cosine of theta is equal to z upon r. Okay, because this distance is r and this is the z component. So from this right triangle, the cosine of the angle theta is z upon r. Okay. So theta is r cosine z upon r. Now we will observe that the polar angle theta has the range 0 to pi. Yeah. This is theta equal to 0, corresponds to the upward vertical z-axis, and theta equal to pi corresponds to the downward z-axis. And points on the xy plane have what value of theta?
Pi by 2.
Yeah, pi upon 2, indeed. Okay, so that is simple enough. Yeah. Any other question? Okay. So we have defined 2 of them, namely r and theta, which are called the radial and polar variables, a radial coordinate and polar angle. Finally, we have to define phi. Okay, I mean the Greek pronunciation is phi, though I sometimes lapse into phi. So suppose we orthogonally project the position vector, namely the position vector r, onto the xy plane. Okay, so that is what is described in this figure. We have the position vector r, it points in some direction, and we project that orthogonally onto the xy plane. So physically that means we have the sun which is far up above the z-axis at infinity, parallel rays of light come down, and the shadow of my radius vector on the xy plane defines a vector that is the orthogonal projection. Now, that vector, this orthogonally projected vector, please tell me what its length is. What is the length of this
R
vector?
sin theta.
Indeed, r sine theta. Okay. This distance was r cosine theta, whereas the projection would have distance, length r sine theta. In any case, you have this vector, the orthogonally projected vector, position vector. Now that vector is a vector in the xy plane. So we can ask what angle it makes with respect to the x-axis. That angle is called phi. Okay, so let me restate it. The azimuthal angle phi is defined as the angle that this projection makes with the x-axis measured counterclockwise. So that's what I indicated in the figure, is measured counterclockwise from the x-axis towards the y-axis. Moreover, we can give a formula for the phi. So phi was the azimuthal angle. Yeah. So basically, we are making use of the concepts from plane polar coordinates, because we are treating this vector on the xy plane in the same way that we treated the vector on the xy plane in the previous discussion. And theta, what we call theta there, theta of plane polar coordinates becomes phi of spherical polar coordinates, right? So perhaps it would have been good if I had used phi in our discussion of plane polar coordinates, but one just needs to get used to this abuse of terminology or abuse of overuse of symbols in a not a particularly transparent manner. Okay. So now we can immediately see that this angle phi is given by the arctangent of y upon x, or rather tan phi is equal to y upon x. This is something we are familiar from plane polar coordinates. The same formula continues to hold from this figure. It is also given by the arc cosine of x upon square root of x squared plus y squared. Yeah. This vector here has a length equal to x squared plus y squared, because those are its components, x and y components. Any question about how we have defined these three variables?
Sir, what will we do with phi on the x-axis if the point is on the z-axis?
You please tell me, what is phi for a point on the z-axis?
Seems undefined.
Correct. Yeah.
Okay.
This is the same problem we faced with points at the origin, a point at the origin in plane polar coordinates. So for a point on the z-axis, phi can be assigned any value, or you may say it's undefined. Yeah.
Okay.
So
Sir.
yeah. So let me make a note of that. So for points on z-axis, phi can be given any value from, well, what's the range of phi?
0 to pi.
0 to no, once again, let's go back to the picture.
Oh, phi 2 pi. Yes, I
Yeah.
yes.
Because it's the azimuthal angle on the plane. Okay, so that goes all the way from 0 to 2 pi. Yeah. Sometimes you would say that on the z-axis, phi is multi-valued. I mean, it doesn't have a unique value. Any value between 0 to 2 pi is allowed. It's ambiguous, basically. Okay, so just to recapitulate, what is the range of possible values of R? the range of
0 to infinity.
correct 0 less than equal to r less than equal to infinity or less than infinity. All right, and theta, the polar angle, goes from 0 to pi. Yeah, that's what we already said. And the azimuthal angle phi goes from 0 to 2 pi. Okay, with 0 and 2 pi being the same. Okay, these are the ranges of the three spherical polar coordinates. We can also express the Cartesian coordinates in terms of spherical polar coordinates. We already did so for z. Z was r cosine theta. From the figure, z is r cosine theta. Now, x and y similarly can be obtained. So the projection here has length r sine theta. So if you further project onto the x-axis, you will get r sine theta cosine phi. So x is r sine theta cosine phi, and y similarly is r sine theta sine phi. I hope I didn't go too fast. Please take a moment to digest this and let me know if there is something I can clarify. I encourage you to draw this picture yourself and chase it down, write all the angles and lengths of the vectors and their projections. Okay. I mean, one more relation is that the tangent of theta, the tangent of the polar angle, is equal to square root of x squared plus y squared upon z. Yeah, so that's again coming from this picture. The tangent of theta is yeah, the opposite by adjacent, and you will see that the adjacent is z and the opposite is given by this length. Yeah, so that we said was square root of x squared plus y squared. Okay, so here are our polar coordinates. Now let us start doing a little bit of physics with this. Let us imagine that a particle is moving in three-dimensional space. The position vector of the particle that is instantaneously located at xyz is then given by a position vector r, which is simply xx hat plus yy hat plus zz hat. Okay, this was in Cartesian coordinates. And in polar coordinates, it is simply r hat. Position vector points radially and therefore, and it has length r. So this is it. From here on, you can proceed like we did in plane polar coordinates and derive formulae for velocity and acceleration. And in order to do that, you will need expressions for r hat, theta hat, phi hat, which I shall define in a moment. So let us look at this figure. Suppose you have a point at this location. This is the radius vector. R hat is then the unit vector pointing radially outwards. Theta hat is the vector pointing in the direction of increasing theta, holding phi and r fixed. So theta hat is a vector in which plane? Please tell me in which plane is the theta hat vector lie?
The plane made by z-axis and r.
Yeah, plane of z hat and r hat or r. So it's a vector in that plane.
So could you repeat?
Yes,
this last
certainly.
thing?
Yeah, certainly. So here is my coordinate system, x, y, z. I don't know if it's very visible. Today it is raining quite a bit in Chennai and the whole place is rather dark. Okay, so I will use this figure. So look, this is my x-axis, this is my y-axis, and this is my z-axis. Okay, Now the radius vector or the position vector of the particle points in some oblique direction generally. It is not necessary in the xy plane or zy plane or any such plane. It is just in some oblique direction. However, that vector, namely the position vector r and the z-axis being two generally linearly independent vectors, would define a plane. All right, are you comfortable with that?
Yes, I got it. I just kind of missed it when you defined theta cap, but it's okay.
Okay, so great. I think you are ahead of me then. So theta cap is simply this vector pointing roughly downwards for this particular case. Finally, our phi hat or phi hat is a vector that points in the xy plane. Yeah, it's a vector that lies in the xy plane. It points in the direction of increasing phi. So this was the projection of r onto this plane, and the direction of increasing phi points this way. So sometimes you can translate this vector and place it there. Yeah, sometimes it's helpful to do that. Yeah. So r hat, theta hat, and phi hat form a triad. And in the problem set, you are asked to show that they form a right-handed orthonormal frame, which I will leave you to do. I hope the picture already makes that very plausible, that they form a right-handed orthonormal frame. Yeah. When I say orthonormal, what I mean is that take my right hand and you must show that if A, B, and C form a right-handed system, then that means that A cross B must be equal to C. Okay, these are unit vectors. Yeah. So when the fingers of the right hand curl from A to B, the thumb of the right hand must point in the direction of C. So I think you can verify that that is the case in this picture. Yeah. But I will let you work it out through the formulae in the second problem set. Okay. So now our next, okay, any question about this?
Yes, sir.
Yes.
What is like phi cap when r is pointing in z direction?
It is not defined. So yes.
So how do we work with it? I mean,
you throw your hands up and despair. That's what you do. Yeah. So just like the plane polar coordinates broke down at the origin, the spherical polar coordinates break down on the z-axis. So one needs to just treat it with care. Yeah, you have to take some limiting process or something. You need to use your ingenuity when such things happen. The simple answer is that phi hat is simply not defined. Too bad. In other words, spherical polar coordinates are not a coordinate system on the whole of R3. They are only on some open subset of R3 that excludes the z-axis. All right. So we have to live with such problems, but over there it works. Yeah. I think this question can be asked once again when we deal with some specific problem. And it's often the case that there are ways around it.
Okay,
so
sir.
Shubham Kumar, right? Yeah. Okay.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah. So let me now go to the next step, which is to express, we would like as before, x hat, y hat, and z hat are a basis for R3. Yeah. In fact, they are a basis at any point of R3, basis of unit vectors, orthonormal basis, in fact. Now, similarly, at any point, you have r hat, theta hat, and phi hat. So we should be able to express the last three in terms of the first three as linear combinations. And I've given the formulae, the relation between the two triples. These formulae are reasonably straightforward to derive from the figure. So let me give an example. Let us suppose, so this is a more detailed figure of spherical polar coordinates. I have a particle located here. This is its position vector r. Now the r hat vector points radially outwards. You want to know what its x, y, and z components are. Now z component is easiest. You just need to project it on the vertical. project it on the vertical, the angle it makes to the vertical was defined as the polar angle theta, and therefore the z component is simply cos theta. So r hat is equal to cosine theta sine z hat. I hope that is clear. Okay, now we come to the question of what its x and y components are. And for that, we need to project the r hat vector onto the xy plane. We already did that. That projection has been drawn here. Remember that it had a length r sine theta if you projected the whole thing. But if you project only the unit vector, you get only sine theta. Okay, so that was the component. That was the magnitude of the projection onto the xy plane. Now that vector is then further resolved into its x and y components. The angle it makes with the x-axis was defined as the azimuthal angle phi, and therefore the x component of r hat is simply sine theta cosine phi. Similarly, the y component is sine theta sine phi. So using this little bit of trigonometry, we have derived a formula for r hat. Okay. So I encourage you to redraw this figure for yourself and rederive what we did, and also do it for phi hat and theta hat. I want you to derive similar formulae for phi hat and theta hat. You can always compare the answers that I have written down here, but it is a good exercise to do it yourself. But any question about how we went about this? Okay. Now that we have these formulae, we are ready then to compute physical quantities like velocity and acceleration. All right. Or for that matter, to check that r hat, theta hat, phi hat forms a right-handed orthonormal system. So you will try to do such things in the second problem set. So I don't want to go through those details here. I think it's very important that you try that by yourself as well. So I will let you do that. Any question about this? All right. So a brief, okay. So now let me proceed to a short discussion of Taylor series or Taylor approximation, Taylor polynomials. I mean, you will learn a lot more about such things in your calculus or analysis courses. So this is just to bring us all on the same page. So first we will begin with a Taylor series for one variable, namely functions of one real variable. Right. So given a function of one real variable f of x that is continuous or hopefully differentiable, maybe once, twice, yeah, few times, yeah. Our aim, we are interested in approximately evaluating this function in the neighborhood of a distinguished point x0. Okay, so this is the job we want to address. And so we basically want to evaluate f of x for x near x0. Now, since the function was continuous, yeah, to first approximation, the value of the function at x can be approximated by the value of the function at x0. So this is the leading approximation or first Taylor approximation. So that is displayed in this figure. This is the graph of this real valued function. You have a distinguished point x0 at which it takes the value f of x0. If x is near x0, then you can approximate the value at x by the value of x0. So this gives you the leading Taylor approximation. That is written over here. Now, suppose you want to improve on this. Replace, you don't want to, so in other words, it's the constant function approximation. We're approximating f of x by a constant function, namely f of x0. The next best possibility is to approximate it by a linear function. Now the question is, what linear function and what slope must that linear function have? The natural answer is that the slope should be the derivative of the function, the tangent. Okay, so that is what is displayed in this graph. So the next, the linear Taylor approximation is to add a term f prime of x naught, namely the slope at x naught times x minus x naught. Okay, so that will give you this approximation. Yeah, so it will, in this picture, if you want to approximate the value here, you will actually get this value. So it's not the best possibility, but it's, at least it was better than perhaps what you started with. Yeah, it could be. Yeah. So that is called the first order Taylor approximation, or linear Taylor approximation. And you can proceed like this. You want to approximate the function not by a linear function, but something slightly better. Well, the next best thing is a parabola. So you could use a parabolic approximation, and that is called the quadratic Taylor approximation. So this is how it goes. Let me just, before I write down the formula, let me just introduce some notation that we will frequently use. Now, to indicate that x minus x naught is small, we will denote it by delta x, capital delta X, or sometimes dx. Yeah, and say that f of x minus f of x naught is delta f. Now, this is an equality. There's no approximation here. However, in the leading Taylor approximation, the linear Taylor approximation, we approximate delta f by the first derivative, namely f prime of x naught times delta x. Okay, so that is an approximation. I trust these things are fairly familiar to you, so I'm going through it a bit fast. My intention here is mostly to introduce notation and a viewpoint. Any question about how we are going about this? Okay. Now it is convenient.
Sir, one question.
Yes.
In our answers, do we, like, is it okay to write dx, or should we be more careful about the notation?
No, it's okay to write dx. If that is appropriate, you are welcome to write dx. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Though I will clarify a little bit what is meant by these things, and that is what the next point is about. Yeah. It is also convenient to introduce the notion of a differential of f. So you have a function f. There's something called a differential of f, which at x is denoted df of x, and it is defined as f prime of x dx. Okay. So dx is called the differential of x. Yeah, this is some purely abstract notion. It is there is no approximation involved. This is a definition. There is some symbol called dx. All right, and of course, physically we think of it as a small displacement of x. Yeah. Now there is some abstract object or algebraic concept called df. That's called the differential of f, and that is by definition f prime of x dx. So this is not some approximation. This is an equality. It's called the differential of f. In differential geometry, df is also called a one form. Okay. So you will learn more about this elsewhere. But for now, we will frequently use this notation. So I just want the name to be available to you. It's called the differential of f. And f prime of x, as you know from calculus, is defined as the derivative, is the limit of delta f by delta x as delta x goes to 0. So, so there is a slight distinction between delta f and df. Okay, so it will be good if you bear that in mind. Delta f is the actual distance, the actual difference between f at 2 points. And so is delta x. Whereas df is actually the differential, as is dx. Okay, so if you want to be a bit careful, you can make this distinction in your work. Any question about this? I admit that my approach is rather pedestrian compared to what you may see in an analysis course. But it is also extremely useful. And I hope you will come to appreciate its value. Okay, so more generally, suppose f is n times differentiable at x naught, then we have the nth order Taylor polynomial approximation to the function. So that's what I have written here. And this is the Taylor polynomial, nth degree polynomial. F of x is equal to f of x naught plus f prime of x naught x minus x naught plus 1/2 f double prime at x naught times x minus x naught squared. And yet more such terms. Each of them comes with a 1/3 factorial, 1/2 factorial such coefficients. The general term is 1/n factorial, nth derivative of f at x naught, x minus x naught to the power of n. Yeah, what is your question?
Also add the constant term to get the exact.
Debashish Biswal, could you ask your question again? I didn't hear you.
It's getting distorted. Just hold on.
I'm sorry, have I made a mistake?
No, I was just saying we could add the constant term in this table following in the approximation. I mean to get the exact.
You could, okay. You are saying that you don't like approximation, you want an equality. Yes, so there will be a remainder term.
Yeah, remainder term.
Yes. Correct. Yeah. So you are absolutely right. You can make this an equality by adding a suitable remainder term, and that is what Taylor's theorem actually does for you. I am writing here just an approximate formula. I have truncated it and thrown away that remainder term. It is very much there if you want an equality. You are quite right.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. Okay. So such series will be very useful in our physics work. So for many functions that we encounter, the Taylor series obtained by letting n go to infinity, that is, we truncated it at n terms here, nth order Taylor polynomial. But suppose you let n go to infinity, you get an infinite series. For many functions, it turns out that this series converges to the function f of x for x in some neighborhood of x naught. Now, such functions are given a name. They are called real analytic. So real analytic function is one for which the Taylor series converges to the function in some neighborhood of the point considered. So this is a substantial concept which one studies in greater depth elsewhere. And it has deep physical significance as well. At this stage, we cannot talk about just yet because we need more examples to understand such concepts. In any case, I have just defined for you what a real analytic function is. One which admits a convergent Taylor expansion. Okay. Now, of course, in practice, we need Taylor series for specific functions. So for instance, if you have the function 1/1 minus x, I encourage you to compute the derivatives of this function around x equal to 0. Yeah, find all the derivatives and assemble them in a Taylor series, and that series turns out to be simply 1 plus x squared plus ... So this is probably one of the more familiar Taylor series, and you can and it turns out that this series converges for absolute value of x less than 1. So the radius of convergence is 1. Yeah. Yeah. Yes, please.
Actually, in 1/1 minus x, you assume that 1/1 minus x is continuous in the neighborhood of 0, where you are expanding in Taylor series. So you are implicitly defining 1/1 minus x in x unequals to 0, and at x equal to 0, you are defining it's 1. So
yes,
that's
sorry. Okay, I mean, yeah, we are assuming that this function, I mean, and that is true, 1/1 minus x is a continuous function at x equal to 0. It's not just continuous, it is differentiable once, twice, thrice, it's infinitely differentiable. So yeah, so we are able to at least write down the terms in the series. It's a separate question to check whether that series converges, but that too is true.
Sir, can we just not treat this like a G, like an infinite GP, where
Yeah.
that will also, like if you expand it out, that will also give us the radius of convergence, right?
Correct. You're right. And if you like, you can just check. You take this to the other side and just multiply 1 minus x times 1 plus x squared and dot. You cancel the terms, add them up, and you will get 1. I mean, of course, such manipulations require some justification that you can rearrange the terms and cancel and so on. But those are the kinds of things that are shown in your analysis course. But you're right. This is simply a geometric progression. That's entirely true. Okay. Any further question about this? Okay. So a continuous function is called C0. Continuous and differentiable with continuous first derivative is denoted C1. Yeah, 2 times differentiable with second derivative continuous is called C2, and so on. All right. So you have CK differentiable functions and real analytic functions. And you have 2 more categories. One is real analytic and smooth. Smooth means all derivatives exist and are continuous. Okay? Derivatives of all orders exist and are continuous. Such functions are denoted C infinity. All derivatives exist and are continuous. That's called C infinity. Finally, you have the concept of real analytic, where not only the derivatives exist, the resulting Taylor series converges to the function. That is called C omega. Okay, so these are the notations for these different types of functions.
So could you scroll down a bit?
Yes. That was Rupak. Oh, sorry, who asked this question?
Rupak, sir.
Rupak. Okay. Rupak Majumdar.
Sir, Rupak. Like T is there.
I'm sorry. I'm very sorry. Rupak. Yeah. Okay.
So we define like C omega about a point, right? In particular.
Exactly. Yeah. The C omega at a point. Yes. It is not everywhere. We have to check it at each point. Okay. So, I mean, this is just terminology, but you will be better off having that terminology. The connection to physics, unfortunately, cannot be demonstrated right now. It is something much deeper, but we cannot convey that with the tools we have currently. Okay, so I leave it to you to calculate the Taylor series for some other familiar functions like the exponential function. You just need to find out its derivatives and assemble the series. What is the radius of convergence of the exponential series?
It's infinite radius of convergence.
Correct. It's infinite radius of convergence. It's as good as it gets. Now, another very useful series is the binomial series.
Sir, I have a question.
Yes. Sorry.
So if you Sankalp Sundar.
Sankalp
Sundar.
Sankalp Sundar, please go ahead.
Yeah. So if you don't mention which point we're expanding about, we have to assume it's 0.
No. You have to assume that I am being economical with the truth and ask me which point. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So yeah. Sometimes we are assuming around 0, and that is implicit, but otherwise you have to ask and get the answer.
Sir, it's like it won't matter if it is converging always to that, and it will matter if we are approximating it, right?
Yeah. So okay, I think. Sorry, please. First, could you tell me who is speaking?
Rishi.
Rishikesh Srinivasan.
Rishi Nanda.
Oh, sorry, Rishi Nanda. Okay.
Sir, so
yes, please ask your question again.
It's like the series, it's okay to expand anywhere it converges to the same function, and approximation is not okay, right?
Okay, see, there are different things here. The function may not even be differentiable 4 times. All right. So this infinite series may not even be writable, but that does not prevent us from using a third order Taylor approximation, which may give an excellent approximation to the values of the function. And we will freely do that. All right. It's a separate question whether the series converges, whether we can even write down all the terms. Those are separate questions. If you simply want to approximate a function, forget about all such things, write down a few terms, use it as well as it works, and dispose of it if it doesn't work. All right. So a first order Taylor approximation often works for many purposes. A quadratic Taylor approximation works for many purposes, even if the function is not 4 times differentiable. Who cares? Yeah. So, I mean, is that the spirit of your question?
I was expanding on what Sankalp was.
Aha. Okay.
Like,
okay.
He asked if we assume at 0. I'm asking if it always converges to the same function, like say e to the x. We can expand about any point and use it elsewhere also.
Okay. No. Look, yeah. See, these are expansions around. Okay, I think Sankalp's question was concerning the point around which you are expanding. That is entirely according to your interest and convenience and the nature of the function. So for instance, I cannot expand the function 1 by 1 minus x around which point?
-1.
Yeah, around x equal to 1, can't write a Taylor series. Yeah, because around x equal to 1, this function is not even continuous. It's not differentiable, nothing. Yeah. So yeah, so you have to choose your point around which you want to do this expansion, depending on the nature of the function and the location, the physical location at which you are interested. So in this case, we were doing it around 0, but there is nothing special about 0. It's just simple. Is that the sort of thing you were asking?
Yes, sir. You were saying we cannot expand it about 1 because it is not even defined. I mean, it is not even behaving the same way around 1.
Yeah.
So if it is behaving the same way, it is okay to expand it.
Correct. If what do you mean by behaving the same way? We mean that the function is continuous, has the first derivative, second derivative, and however many derivatives you want to write your Taylor series for. Taylor point. Yeah, you just need to check that much. Then you are free to use any point. Yes. I think somebody had raised a hand, but that hand has gone away. So, okay. So let me just briefly mention this binomial series, which is extremely useful in various problems of physics and mathematics. So the binomial series is 1 plus x to the power of nu. It's an expansion around x equal to 0. It is the series 1 plus nu x plus nu times nu minus 1 by 1 times 2x squared plus nu times nu minus 1 times nu minus 2 divided by 1, 2, 3 times x cubed, which I have omitted, plus ... So this is so useful a series that it is convenient to commit it to memory. Now this series converges for the absolute value of x less than 1 in magnitude. And nu can be any real number, or in fact also complex number. Yeah, so it's a very general series. Now if nu were a positive integer n, then this series actually terminates, because beyond some point nu minus n will be 0. Yeah, so if n was 2, then this series will terminate after 2 terms, after x squared term. Yeah, in that case we recover the more familiar binomial expansion with coefficients given by the combinatorial factors. Okay, NCR x to the power of r. Yeah, summation r equal to 0 to. Yeah, so this is a generalization of that series. So to find the coefficients, of course, the strategy is simply to find the derivatives of this function, evaluate them at 0. Then you will get these coefficients. Yeah, so you can do it for this function 1 upon the square root of 1 plus x and discover what the coefficients are. I leave that to you. Any questions so far? Okay, Shakti Chauhan's question, please.
Sir, when we use the word origin of any reference, sir, are we free to choose the origin of reference, like any reference can we choose for a particular problem?
Yeah, you are free to choose it, but you exercise that freedom with some responsibility, because if you choose an origin that's not convenient, you will make your life and job much harder. So if you're told that the sun is located somewhere and you're interested in the motion of the earth around it, it is convenient to pick the origin at the location of the sun, for instance, or maybe the center of mass of the system. You could, of course, choose the origin to be at infinity. Well, that's all fine, but it may be very inconvenient. Yeah. So yes.
So isn't it convenient to choose the origin at the observer location?
Sometimes, yes, yes. If you are interested in some things concerning some aspects, let's take. See, it's not always convenient to be the observer's location. See, it will really depend what kind of. Suppose you are interested in studying the motion of this bottle, yeah, in this room, and you're especially interested in its rotational motion. Okay, not its translational motion. It can move around, but it can also rotate. All right. So if you're interested in studying its rotational motion, it is convenient to pick your origin of your coordinate system to be at the center of the bottle, or at least the point about which the bottle is rotating, at least at the instant considered. So yeah, so it really depends on the physical problem you're studying. We cannot make very general comments in that respect. Yeah, does that help? Okay.
Yeah, yes.
Okay, your hand is gone. So, okay. Now, the concept of Taylor series can be extended to more than one variable. Suppose you have a function of two real variables, a real valued function of two real variables, namely a function from R2 to R. Yeah. Then we can write down the Taylor expansion of f around a point x0, y0, at which the function is sufficiently differentiable. I will simply write the formula and let you understand it. In some sense, you can get this formula by thinking of f as a function of x, writing that Taylor expansion, and then expanding the coefficients themselves in Taylor series in y. Okay, so you can do a kind of double expansion to get such a series. But the structure of the series is very recognizable and pleasing. So the terms are very easy to remember. So f of x comma y is equal to first approximation, it's simply the value of the function at the reference location x0, y0, about which the expansion is being performed. Then you've got the linear approximation. The linear approximation must have terms coming linear in x as well as linear in y. The corresponding coefficients, of course, when I say linear in x, it is x minus x0, because you're doing an expansion around x0. So the x minus x0 is the departure of x from x0, which you may call delta x, and this is delta y. Okay. Now the coefficient of that is basically the slope, as we had previously. So in this case, the derivative of f with respect to x is replaced by the partial derivative of x with respect to x. And similarly, partial derivative of f with respect to y, of course, all evaluated at the reference location, point at which you're doing the expansion, around which you're doing the expansion. So you have two such terms. Yeah, that will be the linear Taylor approximation, Taylor polynomial. Then you've got the quadratic Taylor polynomial. You need a few more terms, quadratic terms. There are 4 of them in this case. Let us see what they are. Yeah. They involve x minus x0 squared, y minus y0 squared, and 2 cross terms involving x minus x0 times y minus y0 and y minus y0 times x minus x0. So these are the 4 quadratic terms, and they have their own coefficients. The second derivative of f with respect to x, partial derivative, the second partial of f with respect to y, the mixed partial, so this is called the mixed partial of x, partial second f dx dy, and d2f dy dx. So these are called the mixed partials. They are the coefficients of these 2 terms. All right. is the notation at least clear to all of you? And have all of you heard of partial derivatives? Or is that a concept that is not familiar? Partial derivative is the same as ordinary derivative holding the other variable fixed. Okay. So if I have f of x comma y is equal to cosine xy, then partial f partial x is what? I differentiate with respect to x holding y fixed. Okay. So I will get minus sine xy times y. Okay. So this is the partial derivative of f with respect to x. Any question about how that is done?
Sir?
Yes, please.
Roshana,
is that right?
Yes, yes.
Yes, please.
For what you've written in f of x comma y,
Yes.
can you explain how does that dou 2f by dou x dou y, like however you pronounce it, how does that work? The second derivative.
Let's do that. Good question. Let's do that. We have computed the first derivative of f. Is this acceptable to you, this formula?
Yes, that I'm familiar.
Oh, great. Okay, great. Then let's go to the next one. I've already differentiated with respect to x. Now I want to differentiate the answer with respect to y. That is the process we are following. Okay, so that is what this order means. Partial x followed by partial y. So that I simply take this formula and differentiate it with respect to y holding x fixed. I'm going to get two terms. Suppose I differentiate y, I will get 1 times minus sine xy. I'm using Leibniz rule of differentiation, product rule. All right. And then I differentiate this sine of xy with respect to y. So I'll get minus cosine xy. And then the chain rule gives me an x. And then there was a y there already. So you have to all tell me whether I've done this right. And Roshana has to tell me if she follows the calculation.
Yes, sir. I can follow.
Okay. So are you now comfortable with computing the second partial of f with respect to x followed by y?
Yes, sir. I understood.
Okay, excellent. Now you can do this in the other order. Yeah, you can first differentiate with respect to y and then with respect to x. All right. And I encourage you to do that. And lo and behold, you will find the two are equal. You will find that the second derivative of f computed with respect to y followed by x is the same as the second derivative of f with respect to x followed by y. So this equality of mixed partials holds for a wide class of functions. We need some mild hypothesis to ensure that this happens. And this is called Clairaut's theorem or Schwarz's theorem. Clairaut worked on the motion of the moon, but among other things, he also, I mean, no wonder, if you want to study the moon, you need lots of variables. Yeah, so you have to know a lot of things. You have to invent lots of things. So anyway, so the equality of mixed partials is guaranteed if the second partial derivatives are continuous. So that is a sufficient condition. So that would mean that these two terms that I've written here separately are actually one and the same. These two terms in the quadratic Taylor approximation are actually one and the same. Okay. Okay. So I know this was somewhat rapid discussion of Taylor series.
Sir,
yes, please. Bijay and Rai, is that?
Yes, sir. Second partial derivative are continuous in sense R2, I mean, from the R2 space to R, or
yes.
We are just seeing that component wise, the continuity?
Yeah, I mean, of course, there are several second partials. I mean, you have df, dxy, and yx. Yeah.
Yes.
So
all of those would be functions R2 to R. So
exactly from R2 to R. So there are several
so
functions
the
from R2 to R.
argument we are assuming is R2 to R.
Exactly from R2 to R. Yeah.
Okay.
Yes. It took a long time to prove this theorem to people's satisfaction. Clairaut gave some rough argument. Took a couple of 100 years or something. Not sure. I mean, something of that sort. At least 100 years. Okay. Any other question about this?
So when a function is set discontinuous when you are dealing with multivariables.
Yes, you can have that. Yes, yeah. Yeah, a step. I mean, the staircase is a discontinuous function of two variables, you could say. The height of steps is discontinuous. And there are functions which violate the equality of mixed partials where these conditions don't hold. Sorry, but am I addressing your question?
xy by x root over x squared plus z squared at 0, that is discontinuous. Hopefully the partial derivative exists, but the total derivative doesn't. So they are along.
Yeah, you can cook up examples where these derivatives don't agree. Yeah. I mean, I don't know the specific one you proposed. I will leave you to check that for yourself.
On 3D graph paper, will it look like a hole in the blanket?
Oh, sure, that is a discontinuous function. Yes, if you, I mean, if you redefine the value at one point to be not the limiting value from all sides, but something else, that will be a discontinuous function of two variables. Yeah, well, not a whole, but you have to raise the point or lower it a little bit. See, this is a discontinuous function of one variable. For two variables, you have to have a little bit more imagination. I am a little bit handicapped in drawing such things, but I can make an attempt if you want. Suppose I have three-dimensional space. I mean, a canyon. I mean, you know, Chamba, which you are from Patna. Okay. I don't know whether you have ravines in Patna. Or if you go a little further east or west, in your Chambal, you have these ravines, right? I mean, where Pulan Devi used to live. Yeah, you have this like step-like formation, a deep gorge. So that is a discontinuous function of two variables. The height function over the Earth's surface is discontinuous if at a point it suddenly drops and then proceeds. Does that help at all?
Yes, sir.
Okay, fine. Okay, so let us now leave our discussion of Taylor series for now, unless there are any further questions. I am sorry, I have gone out of time. I've seriously exceeded the time limit. So I will talk about vector calculus next time, namely on Thursday. I apologize for this delay. Unless there are some urgent questions now, we shall end this lecture and continue next time. So please do tell me. I got carried away by the questions. I'm sorry about that. You deserve a good lunch as well. Any further questions? All right. So then please enjoy your lunch and we shall reconvene on Thursday morning. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
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 Yeah,
Thank
most
you,
welcome.
sir. Thank you, sir.
Sure.